Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law? And what does it get wrong? How is law important to understanding the film? And what does the film teach us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? Our film this episode is Inherit the Wind, a 1960 film that's a fictionalized account of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, where a local teacher is put on trial for teaching about human evolution in public school in violation of Tennessee state law. The film was directed by Stanley Kramer and based on a play by Jerome Lawrence and Robert Edwin Lee. It stars Spencer Tracy as Henry Drummond, patterned after celebrated defense attorney Clarence Darrow, Frederick Marsh as the prosecutor Matthew Harrison Brady, based on the famous three-time presidential candidate, former Secretary of State, and renowned fundamentalist Christian spokesperson William Jennings Bryan. Dick York is Bertram Cates, who is patterned after the high school teacher John Scopes, and Gene Kelly plays reporter E.K. Hornbeck, who's based on the journalist H.L. Mencken. For fans of the TV show MASH, you'll enjoy seeing Harry Morgan as the trial judge. The film not only provides a glimpse into the role of religion in public life in America in the 1920s, it also conveys important messages about conformism and freedom of thought directed at the McCarthyism of its own era, messages that continue to reverberate today. My guest to talk about Inherit the Wind is Nell Minow. Nell has been a professional movie critic since 1995 with many articles and some books, and is now a contributing editor at RogerEbert.com and online and on the radio every week as the Movie Mom. She's also worked for the past 30 years on behalf of institutional shareholders on corporate governance issues, with dozens of articles and several books on the subject. As a movie critic and lover of law and film, and the two together, it's wonderful to have Nell on the podcast. So welcome, Nell.
Thank you very much. This is one of my favorite movies, and I'm very, very happy to be here to talk about it. I wanted to begin by saying something about sort of my own connection to some of the issues that are in the movie. When I was in fourth grade, my family moved, and I went from one public school to another in another jurisdiction. And in the new public school that I went to, we prayed in school every morning. And that was very disturbing to me as a Jewish child to have to say Christian prayers in school. But I was the new kid in school. I didn't want to say anything to anybody. And by the time I get to fifth grade, the Supreme Court, which was just a few blocks down the street from my school, had ruled that I didn't have to do that anymore. And that was part of what got me interested in the law to begin with, aside from the fact that a lot of lawyers in my family, was understanding that I could have a problem that I never mentioned to anybody and that it could be resolved in such a satisfying way by a legal challenge. So I've been very, very interested in that as an issue. And of course, it's often attributed to Mark Twain. He didn't really say it, that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. But not only did the 1960s era rhyme with the era of the Scopes trial, but we seem to be rhyming with it again now. We're still having big fights about what goes on in school. And one of my favorites was that recently in Idaho, the state legislature considered changing the state constitution, which prohibits tax dollars going to religious schools. And it got stalled when the Satanic Temple showed up and said, we think this is a great idea because we're planning a school and we're going to have critical race theory in it, and we're going to have all kinds of wonderful woke stuff in it. So hand us the money. And it got it shut down completely. So these issues remain as vital now as they were in the Scopes era, in the Stanley Kramer era, and in our era.
No, that's so true. And it's so interesting you have that personal connection to it. And that's around the time, and we'll talk about the Scopes trial, where the Supreme Court finally, I think it was 1968, in Epperson versus Arkansas, where they declare unconstitutional the Arkansas state law banning the teaching of evolution in schools as a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. But as you said, these issues continue today. And I think one of the fascinating things I hope we can talk about is kind of what's changed, which I think is a lot, and also what hasn't changed from the 1920s era when the Scopes trial took place. So can you take us back to 1925, the social, cultural context, which is the backdrop for the trial, Scopes monkey trial, and the film?
It's easy to look back on almost any era and say it was an era of upheaval, but certainly the 1920s, the 10s and 20s were an era of upheaval. And we tend to see a rise in fundamentalism at the same time that there are a lot of technical changes. And again, we're seeing that now. So when people feel that everything is changing all around them, they tend to clamp down on something that they feel that they can control and that feels safe to them. And that was what was going on here. And I'm going to say something on behalf of William Jennings Bryan, because he wasn't only the prosecutor in this trial, he was the promoter of the law. He was defending a law that he promoted, that he drafted. And this was hugely important to him, not because, and this is one of the ways in which I think the movie's unfair to him, not because he was a Bible thumping, put my fingers in my ears, I don't want to know about it person. He had read Darwin's book. He had debated the issues before, but he wasn't wrong in saying that I'm afraid if these ideas get pervasive in our society, it will lead to some very bad things like perhaps eugenics, which is a fair point. I don't think the answer to that point is trying to keep it away from people. One of my favorite points in the movie is when the student, Mr. Cates, is on the stand and Spencer Tracy, as Clarence Darrow / Henry Drummond, asks him, what do you think about that? And he says, I have to think about it. And he says, well, that's it. That's why we're here. We're here because the more ideas are in front of you, the better your judgment about it will be. And that's also the idea of the law, too. Whether we're in the courtroom or whether we're in the legislature, we believe in the marketplace of ideas. And I was once on September 17th, 1979, so it was the 100th anniversary of the Constitution. I was asked to speak to a group of young school children about the Constitution. And I decided the one thing I was going to say to them is, we're not afraid of ideas. That's why we have the First Amendment. I spent the whole time talking about that. And to me, that is the bedrock of this country. We're not afraid of ideas. We're always healthier by hearing the good ideas and the bad ideas and figuring out what's right. And of course, that's what happens in a courtroom with limits. And we're going to talk about some of the evidentiary rulings. But I think that is what is going on. So to answer your question, what was it like? This was an era of prohibition. It was an era where the women had just gotten the right to vote. It was an era of changes in technology. And it was an era of fundamentalism. And interestingly, the church really split between what they call the modernists, who were not literal believers in the inerrancy of the Bible, and the fundamentalists. And the fundamentalists really clamped down and thought a good way for them to promote their ideas was to pursue legislation like this.
Yeah, and as you said, William Jennings Bryan also had a lot of what would today people would say were were at the time, very progressive ideas. So he kind of comes off a biblical literalist, right? He was a little more nuanced.
He said, I don't think about what I don't think about. And he's challenged, well, do you ever think about what you do think about? Which I think is, one of the great questions of all time. That's wonderful about that character. That is not the real William Jennings Bryan.
The film starts with Cates, with Birds and Cates, right? You got to toggle back and forth.
The three names. And by the way, for fans of classic television, of course, you've got Dick York from Bewitched as Cates.
Exactly. So the Dick York character, Cates, which is clearly John Scopes, it starts off with this sort of ominous scene where these people from the town to the background music of old time religion come in and interrupt his class. They come in, he's teaching his high school class, and they arrest him. He's detained pending trial. That's sort of the way it plays out in the film. In real life, it was a little bit different, right? It was a test case that was organized by the American Civil Liberties Union, which had just sort of started out. They financed it. They pursued Clarence Darrow. And this was an effort to try to tee up a challenge. They
advertised. They advertised in the newspaper looking for somebody. There's nothing wrong with that. Rosa Parks was also in that position where they said, we want to test this law. Would you like to be the test case? So there's nothing wrong with that, but it's certainly not the way it's portrayed. Furthermore, there's no evidence that he actually did teach evolution. He agreed to say that he did and got students to say that he did. There's a reason that drama is called drama. If we try to portray it that way in the movie, it wouldn't be that interesting. Yeah, they do come right into the classroom. They do also, though, at that same time in the movie, have a group of businessmen sitting around talking and saying, well, I believe that we have to move with the times, but, of course, I believe in the Bible, but, they're much more moderate than the song and the breaking into the classroom would have you believe.
Yeah, and the businessmen, I think, saw it as a opportunity for the town to get some attention. I think that the sort of spectacle that it became was viewed positively, if I'm not incorrect, by some of the businessmen in the town.
There's no question. The evidence is that the businessmen wanted it to happen and correctly predicted that it would turn into what today we would call a media circus.
Exactly. I think about that media circus, and we can come back to that later. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Ace in the Hole film. I just felt like it
Yeah,
was
of course.
the Billy Wilder movie. They really captured that idea of like the media circus. That's what jumps out. It does a good job of it. Yeah, and also it's interesting. If I'm not incorrect, they didn't put Cates on the stand or Scopes on the stand in the trial because of exactly what you said. They were worried that because he may not have actually taught.
He was a substitute teacher. He was
Yeah.
not even a full-time teacher.
So anyway, be it as may, I mean, it's still an important case in life, it's an important case in the movie, but why was the case so important at the time? And why was the ACLU and others looking to bring this challenge in 1925?
Well, as you pointed out, the ACLU was a brand new organization back then. They really started during World War I to pursue free speech. They were very interested in all elements of the First Amendment, as they continue to be, including the Establishment Clause. And they were young, they were feisty, and they were interested in doing some high profile work. And nothing could be more profile than having two of the most famous people in the country who knew each other, liked each other, had debated each other in the past, but we don't get any of that in the movie. We do get a sense when Henry Drummond, I'm just going to call him Clarence Darrow, when Clarence Darrow says he's a great man, you do get a sense of that. They're not, horribly hostile to each other. That would be of tremendous value in establishing what today we would call their brand.
Was there any, beyond sort of the ACLU asserting itself, was there another reason that this case needed to be brought?
Tennessee was not the only state. There were 22 states. William Jennings Bryan was making this his full-time job. He was promoting these laws throughout the country. And so I think they were afraid, to say, well, Tennessee's not doing anything with it. That was not enough. They were afraid that it was going to, as today we would say, go viral.
In the film, the judge, John Ralston, was the state court judge. And in the film, it's not Tennessee, it's Hillsborough. So it's a fictionalized location. And that's Harry Morgan from MASH. I think more avuncular than he was in real life. But in any event, he refuses to allow the defense to introduce scientific evidence to support human evolution. And there's arguments back and forth.
We shall proceed with the case for the defense.
I'd like to call Dr. Amos Keller, the head of the Department of Zoology at the University of Chicago.
Objection?
On what grounds?
I wish to inquire what possible relevance the testimony of a zoology professor can have in his trial.
Why, it has every relevance. My client is on trial for teaching evolution. Certainly any testimony relating to his so-called infringement of the law must be admitted.
Irrelevant, immaterial, inadmissible.
But why? If Bertram Cates were on trial for murder, would it be irrelevant to call in witnesses to examine the weapon? Would it rule out testimony that the so-called murder weapon was incapable of firing a bullet?
I fail to grasp the learned counsel's meaning.
Your Honor, the defense wishes to place Dr. Keller on the stand so that he can explain to the gentlemen of the jury the exact meaning of the theory of evolution. How can they pass judgment if they don't know what it's all about?
I hold that the very law we are here to enforce excludes such testimony. The people of this state have made it very clear that they do not want this zoological hogwash slobbing around the schoolrooms. And I refuse to allow these agnostic scientists to employ this courtroom as a sounding board, as a platform from which they can shout their heresies into the headlines. The bench rules that zoology is irrelevant to the case.
Does Your Honor deny in one breath the existence of zoology, geology, and archaeology?
We do not deny the existence of these sciences, but they do not relate to this point of law.
In your article about the movie, you talk about the film being a battle between empiricism and faith. Can you talk a little bit more about that and also about the ruling on excluding the expert testimony?
There's a lot of stuff that happens in that trial that should have been excluded. And in fact, in the real trial, the jury was not present for a lot of that extraneous stuff. So there was some understanding of what the trial was supposed to be about. So if I can just bring in a movie from last year that was also based on a true case, the movie The Burial with Jamie Foxx is a movie about a trial where so much evidence comes in that has nothing to do with the basis of the case. And clearly the case is decided by the jury on the basis of this highly prejudicial, irrelevant in legal terms material. So this is, again, a very big issue. But in theory, in law school theory, the idea of the trial was about one thing. Did he violate the law? So let's assume for the moment that he did at one point in his brief stints as a substitute teacher mention evolution. So let's assume that factually he did do that. But that is the basis of that case. Factually, did he violate the law? The place where you challenge the validity of the law is not the trial court. And so to present the evidence, as much as we might love to hear it, because we tend to be empiricists, the evidence about the importance or validity of science, the scientific approach, really is not relevant to that issue. It's not really relevant to the issue of whether the law should be invalidated or not. The only thing that is relevant and is the basis of that later Supreme Court decision that you mentioned is, does it violate the Establishment Clause of the Constitution to impose on a public school curriculum one particular religion's view, one subset of one religion's particular view of the facts? And that, I think, obviously is correctly decided. But in terms of putting on a play or making a movie, was that colorful? And did it help tell the story that they wanted to tell? Sure. In terms of what the ruling should have been, yeah, Harry Morgan is correct that that was not relevant to the issue that was before the court and to be decided by the jury.
It seemed kind of correct, as you said. I mean, the issue was, did he teach evolution in school in violation of the Butler Act, which was the Tennessee law at the time? The Hillsborough law was called the movie. The answer is yes. I mean, assuming there was a factual predicate and all these issues and the legal challenges were superfluous. It's there for the drama and you need it to underscore the underlying battle of ideas. But all those legal challenges, which they made, I think they made an Establishment Clause challenge. They made a freedom of speech, freedom of expression challenge. I think there was a challenge to vagueness, that the law was too vague in terms of how do you define evolution. All those legal challenges, which were kind of the bread and butter of the effort to overturn the law, were not relevant. It's kind of interesting. You get this ruling excluding the evidence, and then Clarence Darrow, or Henry Drummond in the film, has a fit, attacks the judge, and he's actually held in contempt.
Yeah, he is in contempt. And again, this part is not true. The local farmer, Noah Beery, who you might know from the Rockford Files.
Right. I was trying to place him. That is who he is.
Noah Beery, the non-believing farmer, puts up his farm as security, and none of that really happened. And as far as I can tell, none of that part about who gets to be called a colonel happened either. So I do think the evidentiary ruling is correct. And just, again, to talk about what's happening today, the notorious say on gay law has been thrown out, and the Florida government has agreed to a settlement that invalidates about 95%, 98% of that law. And that, again, was about what can be taught in the schools based on a very minority view, I would say a very minority religious view. And I'm a little nervous about this particular Supreme Court, but I hope that the understanding of the Supreme Court is that you have freedom to practice your religion. You do not get to impose that on anybody else. And unfortunately, I think some of their rulings have blurred that line.
Yeah, it's definitely a very different court than the court that decided the cases, the parent school case and the Epperson case, striking down the...
I want to mention the Kicksmiller case, because that was a Reagan judge who gave what I think is the very best ruling, the best decision ever written on this exact issue. And what happened was that understanding that teaching the inerrancy of the Bible was not going to work in science class, the people who didn't want to give up on that created a theory called intelligent design, which they said was science and should be taught alongside of evolution as a sort of both sidesism alternate interpretation. And that was a very clever approach on their part. But this judge in the Kicksmiller case said, I'm sorry, it's not science. You can teach French in school, but you can't teach French in science class. And if you're going to call it science, it has to meet the criteria that science applies to itself, which is that it allows for proof, it allows for empiricism, it allows for tests, etc. And so I think that case is just as important as the Supreme Court case.
Absolutely. And I mean, that is kind of the pivot, or we see that starting especially in the 1960s, right? Maybe with sort of creation sciences, saying you can't teach evolution, you teach both side by side, and they try to justify, that this is science. There's a scientific explanation, and to kind of bring the Bible out of the realm of faith and religion into the realm of science.
When I was in sixth grade, so now you've heard about my fourth grade and my fifth grade. When I was in sixth grade, a student actually raised his hand in science class and said, "How do you square what you're telling us with the Bible?" And my teacher gave what I think was a very good answer, although I don't know that it would be allowed today. He said, "What do you think? God waved a magic wand? Don't you want to know how he did it?" And I thought that was a pretty good answer.
Yeah, it's a very good answer, especially in the setting of school class. The question about how the biblical literalism is challenged in probably the most climactic moments of the film, which is the cross-examination by Drummond, Clarence Darrow of Brady, or William Jennings Bryan, where the way the film recounts it is after Darrow is denied the opportunity to put on all of his expert testimony, he calls Brady as his expert witness on the Bible, and Brady takes the bait and gets on the stand. And then Clarence Darrow does this very deft cross-examination of Brady.
Mr. Brady, why do you deny the one faculty of man that raises him above the other creatures of the earth? The power of his brain to reason. What other merit have we? The elephant is larger, the horse is swifter and stronger, the butterfly is far more beautiful, the mosquito is more prolific, even the simple sponge is more durable. What does a sponge think?
I don't know. I am a man, not a sponge.
What do you think a sponge thinks?
If the Lord wishes a sponge to think, it thinks.
Do you think a man should have the same privilege as a sponge?
Of course.
This man wishes to be accorded the same privilege as a sponge. He wishes to think.
What was achieved through the cross-examination? What was your take on it?
Well, first of all, that is one part that is directly taken from the transcript. So that is the most authentic part of the movie. And it's actually one of my favorite scenes of any movie ever, because it is about the issue of how we know what we know. He says, does a sponge think? Well, I don't know if God wants him to think he thinks. Well, don't you want to exercise the same ability that God gave a sponge? And it seems to me that when Bryan says, I don't think about what I don't think about, he loses it right there, even though, let's be clear, that Clarence Darrow lost the case, which was overturned on a technicality and then never enforced. But the question before the court was, did Scopes teach evolution? And the court found that he had violated the law. But the movie, again, very much dramatizes that this almost physically broke Bryan's heart. And he did die just a few days after the trial. And by the way, I do want to point out that Frederick March's real life wife played his wife in the film. And she was a great theater actress. She didn't make many films. And so it's very moving to me to see them together. So I think that really is not the crux of the case, because the case is about whether he violated the law. And we're all admitting that he did, but about what we are as human beings. Are we here to float through our days, or are we here to think? And if you are going to be literal about the Bible, not in terms of the years and all that, but if you're going to take the Bible seriously, one of the core principles of the Bible is that we're made in God's image. And if God gave us a heart and a brain, presumably he wants us to use them both. As you know, in my law review article, I compared this movie to one that in most ways is very dissimilar, which is Miracle on 34th Street. But in a way, they're really the same question, which is, do we believe in faith, or do we believe what we can prove? And the question of, is Santa Claus real? That is a faith answer. And yet, how does the court go? They finally say, well, the mail is coming to him and the US government thinks Santa Claus is good enough for me. So there's still some element of proof there. There's some element of expertise anyway, of an expert witness, the federal government. And in both cases, in both movies, the prosecutors put on the witness stand. And also, and most important, in both cases, the judge ultimately rules on the basis of his political advisors.
That was fascinating, right? In Miracle on 34th Street, the advisor to the judge says, you're not going to get elected again. There's a warning to the judge, Harry Morgan character, like, go easy. And so basically there's kind of a nominal fine that he hands out, no imprisonment, which Brady in the movie objects to. Although, as I understand it, in real life, William Jennings Bryan did not push for imprisonment
and was willing to pay his fine.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, look, Lawrence and Lee said, this is not history. They say that in their intro to the play. It's not history. It's inspired by it. And, of course, any movie that is made, any play that is written, is as much about its own time as it is about the time it's depicting. And it's not a coincidence that The Crucible is coming out at the same time too, which ostensibly is about the Salem witch trials, but like this was very much a response to the McCarthy era. I mean, people tend to think about the 50s as being a very idyllic period, but in addition to the Cold War and the bomb and upheavals of the 60s, which were all sparked by that, in response to the pendulum swing. So you had the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, all of that was in response to the 50s. So there was a lot of unhappiness there.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, one of the playwrights, Jerome Lawrence, says, we use the teaching of evolution as a parable, a metaphor for any kind of mind control. It's not science versus religion, it's about the right to think.
That's why I love this movie, because it's about the right to think. It's about going back to that witness, the student. I have to think about it. Yes, that's the right answer. You think about it.
Charles Darwin's theory of the evolution and the descent of man.
Yes, sir.
That's right, Howard. That's the very book he read to you in your classroom. Now, Howard, tell me, you think there was anything wrong in that?
Well, I don't know.
Objection, Your Honor. The defense is asking that a 15-year-old boy hand down an opinion on a question of morality.
I am trying to establish that Howard or Colonel Brady or Charles Darwin or anyone sitting in this courtroom or you, sir, has the right to think.
And so the verdict, as you mentioned, right, Scopes is convicted. Even if he loses the larger war, Bryan wins the battle, or the prosecution wins the battle. The verdict's overturned on a technicality, which I looked up. Interestingly, it's because the technicality was in the state Supreme Court, they've set aside the conviction because the fine was over $50, that only the jury had the authority to impose the fine and not the judge. So that's the technicality. That's a fascinating matter of Tennessee law circa 1955. Yeah.
I have a feeling that the political advisors may have played a role there too. But it's not a spoiler at this point to say that, Stanley Kramer's view on the whole matter really comes out with the two books that Drummond carries out of the courtroom, which are the Darwin book and the Bible.
Right. And that is in that last scene when he's talking to the H.L. Mencken character. They break. Darrow and Mencken break at the end of the trial because Darrow thinks he's just too cynical and you've got to have both. And there's a way to reconcile them.
He would fit in Ace in the Hole. I mean, he's about as cynical as you could possibly get. Played by Gene Kelly. It's only the fact that he's played by Gene Kelly. We don't realize he's really just a rotten person. But Gene Kelly is always so appealing, it's easy to overlook that. But he is awful. He doesn't like anybody. He's a real sourpuss. He literally offers an apple to that nice young girl and then says, I'm not the serpent. And of course, that is also about thinking, isn't it? It's about thinking. It's about, do we want to be living in a perpetual bliss of the Garden of Eden, or do we want to struggle and take on the challenges of life? Anyway, so that's the H.L. Mencken character. And you asked in an email to me about why he's sitting at the defense table, which I never thought about before, but I have to think it's because his paper was paying Drummond. So in a way, he was the client.
You're right. That may be the basis. They may have done it for dramatic purposes.
Absolutely. Speaking of dramatic purposes, we have to mention that there are two completely made up characters, the preacher and his daughter, who's supposed to be the girlfriend of Scopes/Cates. And that I consider fully excusable as a kind of a shorthand for conveying what it was that you had to create. Anytime that you've got any story that you're telling dramatically, it's always like a boy band. You got to have somebody who's the cute one and someone who's the rebel and somebody who's this, you had to have some character there who is going to represent one point of view in the movie. And that's what they're doing there.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. It was fictionalized, but I don't think it detracted from the message or even distorted the history in any meaningful way. And the verdict, right? So the verdict is imposed and then it's over, it's set aside on appeal because it's just on the technicality. They don't get to the constitutional issue. So it never goes to the Supreme Court. And then the law itself, or the law of a different state, teaching evolution in school, doesn't get addressed by the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, until, 60 years later. So what happens after the trial? Because the way the movie depicts it is the prosecution wins, but in terms of the press and the larger way that people view it, they're kind of ridiculed. The Hillsborough and the teaching creation or barring evolution, teaching evolution is kind of ridiculed. And it looks like sort of a victory for the forces of free thought and individual freedom. What's your take on what happened after?
Well, a number of states adopted the law following the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't have ended up in the Supreme Court so many years later. And it continues to this day. We've had more school board fights in the last 3 years than in any time of my life that I can remember. And we're going to continue to fight about that.
I mean, it seems like fundamentalism doesn't retreat into the background after the trial, which is a little bit of the impression you get from the film and maybe seeing the film in 1960.
I want to tell you something that happened in thinking about talking to you today. I was doing a little research on the Scopes trial, and among the sources that I found online were two that came from entities whose names sounded very reliable. One was the Bill of Rights Institute, and the other was something about the Constitution. I said, okay, great. And so I'm reading what they have to say. And that one happened to be, it was a resource for AP history teachers. So it had questions, it had a very long discussion of the case, but there was something about the description that kind of seemed off to me. For one thing, it referred to the teaching of science as being privileged over other kinds of approaches. And so I did a little extra research based on the kind of work I do in my other life. And both of those entities are funded by the Koch brothers. So that's where it's going on now. It's not just fights in the school board. It's not just no say on gay legislation. There are a lot of resources out there that purport to be objective, purport to be legitimate, do not disclose what their funding is, and are still quite slanted.
And that seems to have changed so much since 1925 and even 1960, when they're depicting the events of 1925 and the trial, is the power and the money that's in the religious right to shape public opinion, right? It seems night and day.
Well, and also the vocabulary has changed very dramatically as we talk about trying to use words like creation science and intelligent design to make it look like it is on an equal basis with evolution. And I think that everything has become so politicized that has permeated this as well. I think in the era that we're talking about in the movie, they are depicted in the movie, the 1920s, it was very clear where your ideas were coming from. All you had to say was, I believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. You didn't have to explain that in any way. You didn't have to justify it in any way. Everybody knew what you're talking about. Now it's sort of permeated, it's subtle, it's communicated in a lot of different ways, including an AP teacher resource, some AP teacher who's just, oh, great, there's this resource I can use for question and answers as I prep my kids for their test, and might not look and see where it's coming from.
Yeah, so the battles continue just at a more granular level.
Yeah, more subtle level. Yeah.
We've talked about some other critiques of the film. One critic of the film, or one critique, was by Andrew Sarris. Bigotry in reverse, objected to its sanctimonious tone. We talked about its portrayal of William Jennings Bryan, but just overall the way they depicted the town, bunch of yokels. Did the film go too far? What did you think of these critiques in terms of setting up the conflict?
I'm not a huge Sarris fan. I don't agree with that at all. I think, in fact, when I went back and watched it again, I had that very much in mind. I remembered it began with Give Me That Old Time Religion, and was concerned that it would be representing the town as a bunch of bigoted Luddites. But I don't think it did. I thought there was a lot of subtlety there. You had Rachel, the preacher's daughter, who I think represented a full character she was sympathetic to her father, but she was wanted to think for herself. And you had Noah Beery, and you had the business people who were, you could say that they were cynically presented because they wanted to make money, but that's what they're there for. So I actually felt that there was a variety. The person who is depicted the worst is certainly the reporter. And I don't think he's anybody's idea of the hero of the movie.
I agree. I think there was some exaggeration perhaps in the film. They stretched it, but you're right. There was sort of some complexity in the community. I mean, I don't think the sort of hanging of Cates or Darrow in effigy, that did not happen. That was, I think, probably out there. But they did recognize that there were different layers of opinion in the town.
They definitely did. And I had remembered that early scene where people have got all the signs, and it does have very much of a circus atmosphere. But even there, you had the guy selling hot dogs. You had a variety of ways of thinking about it. And furthermore, and you may say that Andrew Sarris, you may say that I'm bigoted, but I think that it's fair to predict people who don't want to think about what they're thinking about as people who don't want to think about what they're thinking about.
What impact did the film have at the time when it came out?
Well, it was a very popular play, and that's why it became a movie. So it was certainly part of that whole era of Stanley Kramer, what they called issue movies. we've got Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and Gentleman's Agreement. And that was that era of people like Dory Sherry making movies. He was a very, very progressive guy who became the head of MGM. And he himself wrote things. He wrote Sunrise at Campobello, which was a very nice play about FDR, really looked at him as a great leader. And so there was a lot of that coming out of Hollywood at that time. And people often ask me about corporate governance movies, since my practice is in corporate governance. And one from that era is Executive Suite, which also echoes the fights we're having about what's called ESG today, because it's about who is going to run the company next. Is it going to be the warm-hearted sort of ESG woke guy, William Holden, or is it going to be the CFO who only looks at the numbers, who I think is our friend Frederick March from this movie? And I think you know where it's going, where Barbara Stanwyck is going to cast her majority shares in favor of the person that she picks. So yeah, that was an era where movies engaged with issues a lot more than I think you see today.
Speaking of its continuing relevance, it's a small scene in the movie, and I probably just piqued my interest more than anything else, where we see the reporter planning to broadcast the jury's verdict via radio, the new technology. Yeah. And radio covered this. It was covered all over the world, huge attention. And he has an exchange, the reporter has an exchange with Brady, William Jennings Bryan, saying that this technology will shout out to 1 million people. But because of Brady's lungs and his oratorical power, he won't have any use for that.
Well, Colonel, there's a little toy you'll never have any use for. Not with your lungs. The radio. You whisper into it and it shouts at 1 million people through loudspeakers.
He's kind of bemused, but I just found that so ironic in a rich way because of the way in which radio as a means of communication has been adopted and used by the religious right today. It sort of struck me as probably not intentional, but it reverberated.
Definitely. And of course, there's also some irony in that he's saying that in a movie, which is also going to reach 1 million people. But yes, it is true. William Jennings Bryan was used to that sort of tent culture where he would go from tent to tent to tent and address adoring crowds. And that was wonderful. But radio did change everything. And as did then television and movies and the internet.
We've talked about the film's relevance at the time it was made, and even today. Are there other things about why this or how this film speaks to us today and why audiences might want to see it and grapple with its themes?
I think it's even more important today than it was when it came out, and that the issues were during the Scopes trial, because we have so many different sources of information. When this movie came out, there were 3 television networks, and everybody watched Walter Cronkite every night. And we had very limited number of very respected news sources. Now everybody gets information from different places and tends to live in an echo chamber or a silo. And so I think it's even more important that a movie like this reminds us of the absolutely essential responsibility we have to consider all points of view as we form our own.
That's very well put. And the dramatization of the trial and just re-engaging with the issues that were raised in the trial, I think it's a film that's really worth viewing. It's a great film. Well, Nell, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your thoughts and wisdom about the movie and about film. It's great to have you on.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Hi again. It's time to answer a question that we received about a prior episode. This question comes from Molly in California, and it's about episode 25, comparing the Caine Mutiny from 1954 and the 2023 remake, The Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. Molly asks about what led to the 2 very different depictions of people of color and women in the 2 films. As my guest Gene Fidel noted during the show, one major difference between the 2 movies was the absence of people of color and women in positions in the armed services from the 1954 film, compared with the important roles they played in the 2023 remake, which featured a Black man as a presiding judge, played by Lance Reddick, and a woman as the lead prosecutor, played by Monica Raymond. Like the Armed Forces, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, or JAG, the military justice branch of the U.S. Air Force, Coast Guard, Marine Corps, and Navy, have been transformed in the nearly 70 years from the Caine Mutiny film to the 2023 remake. While changes have occurred over time, 2 key points that set this important and dramatic transformation in motion occurred around the time of the first film, both during the Truman administration. Executive Order 9981 from 1948, which desegregated the armed forces, and the Women's Armed Service Integration Act from the same year, which allowed for the first time women to serve as regular members of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. While there's been an emphasis on further increasing diversity in the JAG Corps, especially among Black Americans, the film shows how much progress has been made in the military in this area as in other public and civic institutions in American life. And just a reminder, if you have a question about a prior episode, please go ahead and email me at jonathanhayfitz@gmail.com. That's Jonathan Hayfitz, my full name, @gmail.com, or just DM me on Twitter or X. Thanks again.